In this chapter, chapter 30, we finally look at human effects on the biosphere. We begin our usual chapter story looking at polar bears. Scientists are able to pretty much go wherever they want to go these days, and the Arctic waters is no exception up at the North Pole, and scientists have studied polar bears up there and have noticed some problems going on with unusually warm temperatures. The ice up there is melting much sooner than usual, and polar bears rely on walking across ice to get to their main food source of seals. But with the global warming and warmer temperatures melting the ice, they have less time to get to their main food source, which is definitely becoming a problem for them. Not to mention other threats as well, such as, remember the concepts of bioaccumulation and biomagnification, with pesticides and mercury polluting waters and working its way up the food chain. Polar bears and other top feeders are being threatened by the buildup of toxins in their tissues and biomagnification, the magnification of these toxins as it moves up the food chain. It would be presumptuous to think that we alone have had a profound impact on the world of life, because as long as the earth has been here, organisms have had an effect on the earth and other living organisms around them, such as the first autotrophs putting oxygen into the atmosphere. But the main problem now is that with humans and with our technology, we make the changes happen so much faster than what would usually occur on Earth. A century ago, Earth's physical and biological resources seemed inexhaustible, and now we know that many of our practices put into place by humans that were largely ignorant of how natural systems operate have taken a heavy toll on the biosphere. The rate of species extinctions is on the rise, and many types of biomes are threatened today. These changes, the methods scientists use to document them, and the ways that we can address them are the focus of this chapter. There is a global extinction crisis. Extinction is the permanent disappearance of a species, and it does happen to be a natural process. In fact, today scientists think that about 99% of all organisms that ever lived are indeed extinct. But as we said earlier, it seems that extinction rates are happening so much faster. So we think, could it be that we're currently in the midst of a mass extinction event? That's when many kinds of organisms and many different habitats become extinct in a relatively short period. And though mass extinctions have happened in the past, this one seems to be caused by humans. A species is considered endangered when one or more of its populations have declined or are declining. A threatened species is one that's likely to become endangered in the near future if current practices aren't changed. Some causes of species decline is overharvesting. We take too many organisms than what we should, and it reduces the population sizes. such as the story of the white abalone in your book. Other causes: habitat destruction, especially threatens endemic species like the panda. Those are species that only come from that area, from where they evolved. Logging destroys habitat, such as the habitat of ivory-billed woodpeckers, the harlequin frog, and gorillas. Plowing of North American prairies threatens prairie-fringed orchids. Destruction of the Indonesian rainforest endangers the world's largest flowers there. Habitat degradation, such as excessive water withdrawals, and aquifer pollution threatens Texas blind salamanders. Beach development interferes with the reproduction of leatherback sea turtles, and Florida manatees are injured by motorboat propellers. Other threats to survival: well, deliberate and accidental species introductions. Those species are called exotic species or invasive species. Often when species are introduced to an area, they don't have any natural predators there to keep their numbers in check. So, if they're well adapted to that area, their numbers can increase unchecked, and they can then threaten other species who really do belong there and have predators there to control their numbers. Of 47,677 species assessed by the International Union for Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, or the IUCN, 36% were threatened or endangered. The threat level for the other 1.8 million named species, even including the essential bacteria, and for millions of species yet to be discovered, is unknown. So in an extinction crisis, it is, of course, a natural process, but human activities are increasing the frequency of extinction events. And species go extinct when they're adversely affected by habitat destruction, degradation, and fragmentation, even with the competition by invasive species. The extent of the species losses, of course, is not fully known. Harmful land use practices. Human activities threaten other species by destroying or degrading habitat, and there's a lot of ways that we can do that, such as by farming, turning land over to agricultural purposes, grazing, where we introduce our own domesticated animals like cows and such, sheep, and they overgraze the area, taking away food from the organisms that live there. And logging, those are major contributors to species loss. Desertification occurs when plowing and grazing removes plants and exposes topsoil to wind erosion. And when you have fewer plants, it means less transpiration. If you remember what transpiration is, that's the process where water travels through a plant from its roots to its leaves, and then leaves the leaves. There you go. Leaves the plant through molecule by molecule into the atmosphere, and that's called transpiration, similar to evaporation, which occurs off the land. And that is part of the important water cycle. So putting less water back into the atmosphere means that there's less rainfall. And then drought occurs, which encourages desertification, and it worsens the drought. So it's like a positive feedback cycle. Deforestation is cutting down of trees, especially in like rainforest areas, and we're doing that at an alarming rate. And of course, that also decreases transpiration that we talked about in the last slide. It encourages flooding and raises the risk of landslides in hilly areas. It also affects local weather. Temperatures rise because of the reduced transpiration and less rainfall. Forests take up and store huge amounts of carbon, so deforestation also contributes to the global climate change. Deforested areas become more nutrient poor, and experimental deforestation increase runoff of essential soil nutrients such as calcium compared with the undisturbed forests. So scientists are studying these test areas to see what the effects are. With harmful land uses, plowing under grasslands, cutting down forests, and such can have huge long-term effects, such as having loss of plants, allowing soil erosion, increasing temperature, and decreasing precipitation. All of this makes it difficult to restore the plant cover that was once there. Acid rain is another problem with pollutants that humans are putting into the atmosphere and into waterways, into soil. Pollutants disrupt physiological processes of organisms. Sulfur dioxides from coal-burning power plants and nitrogen oxides from burning gas and oil are common air pollutants. A pollutant is a substance that released into the environment by human activities and interferes with the function of organisms that evolved in the absence of that substance, or at least with lower levels. Dry acid deposition occurs when dry dust particles coated with airborne sulfur and nitrogen fall to the ground. Wet acid deposition, or acid rain, occurs when pollutants combine with water and fall as acidic precipitation. Acid rain is a low pH. Its pH that is low is underneath the neutral 7 pH. Acid rain in aquatic habitats prevent fish eggs from developing and kills adult fish, resulting in fish kills. Acid rain in forests burns tree leaves, makes trees more susceptible to insects and pathogens. Acid rain alters the composition of soils as well. Positive hydrogen ions, which occur in acids, displace the positive nutrient ions such as calcium, causing nutrient loss. Acidity causes soil particles to release metals like aluminums that harm plants. Chemicals released by human activities can then accumulate in the bodies of organisms and that would interfere with their metabolism. This is called bioaccumulation. Mercury and DDT are examples of toxins that bioaccumulate. In animals, hydrophobic chemical pollutants ingested or absorbed across the skin accumulate in fatty tissues. Pollutant concentration in tissues increases with age and with trophic level. It's like it's magnified up the food chain. We've talked about this before. That's called biological magnification. As a result of bioaccumulation and biological magnification, even seemingly low environmental concentrations can have a huge effect on species, especially sometimes our top-level predators. Like in the 1960s, ospreys were driven towards extinction by the widespread use of DDT. This DDT chemical interferes with eggshell formation. Amazingly enough, the concentration of DDT in osprey tissues was 276,000 times higher than it was in the water. Remember, our own uh, national bird, the bald eagle, had the same problem. Pollutants that come from a few easily identifiable sites, which are called point sources, such as a factory, are the easiest to control. Pollution, though, from widespread release of pollutants, non-point sources, like oil that drips from vehicles, is much more difficult to control and really can add up. The trouble with trash. Trash buried in the ground, such as lead from batteries, can contaminate groundwater. Trash dumped at sea, like plastics, harms marine life. Plastic and other garbage that enters our coastal waters persists for many years. It'd be important for humans to help reduce this risk by avoid buying plastics or by recycling and disposing of these items properly. Some other effects of these plastics are when seabirds mistake them for food and feed on them or feed them to their chicks, which has deadly results, or even sometimes can become entangled in them. Ozone depletion and pollution. Ozone is said to be good up high, but bad nearby. In the upper atmosphere, ozone absorbs most incoming UV light that damages our own DNA and causes mutations. But near the ground, it's a harmful pollutant. Our ozone layer, also called O3, is our high atmospheric layer that absorbs ultraviolet radiation coming from the sun. When the ozone layer is depleted, we see more instances of skin cancer and damage of eyes, such as cataracts and other DNA mutations. In the mid-70s, scientists noticed that the Earth's ozone layer was thinning, and in particular, it was over the over the Antarctica. They called that the ozone hole. In 1987, countries worldwide agreed to phase out what they thought was causing the ozone hole, CFCs or chlorofluorocarbons that came in some of our products that we were making as humans, such as in aerosol cans. CFCs break down very slowly, so it has taken a while to see the effect of this. Near the ground, ozone irritates eyes and respiratory tracts of humans and wildlife alike and interferes with plant growth. Ground level ozone forms when nitrogen oxides and volatile organic compounds released by burning or evaporating fossil fuels are exposed to sunlight. And of course, warm temperatures speed the reaction. Climate change due to increasing average temperatures is the most widespread threat to habitats worldwide. Thermal expansion and meltwater from glaciers causes sea levels to rise, flooding coastal wetlands. Temperature changes disrupt life cycle events such as tree flowering and animal migration and breeding seasons. Some species are shifting their ranges to higher latitudes or elevations. Some that can't move are stressed or dying. Many weather patterns are expected to change as rising land and sea temperatures affect evaporation, winds, and currents. Extremes in rainfall patterns, periods of drought interrupted by unusually heavy rains, and increase in hurricane intensities are both examples of some of the effects of global climate change. Rising levels of CO2 and other greenhouse gases are the most likely cause of global climate change. Fossil fuel combustion is our main source of greenhouse gas. In summary, the effects of pollutants, some fall to the earth as acid rain and can harm aquatic communities and soils. Other pollutants disrupt metabolism when they accumulate to high levels in animal bodies. And still others harm the protective ozone layer or contribute to global climate change. Conservation biology is an area that seeks ways to protect our world's existing biodiversity. Biodiversity is the genetic variation within species and within ecosystems. Biodiversity is important. If all organisms were the same of a population, such as we're all clones of each other, it would be very easy for something like a pathogen to come along and destroy everybody because everybody's the same. There's no differences, there's no variation. So biodiversity is important to increase chances of species survival. Biological wealth or biodiversity is measured at 3 levels: genetic diversity within the species, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. Biodiversity, unfortunately, is declining at all 3 levels in all regions. That is very scary. Conservation biology addresses these declines and encourages people to value our Earth's biodiversity. Healthy ecosystems are essential to human survival. They produce our oxygen and our food. They remove, decompose, and detoxify waste. They prevent erosion and reduce risk of flooding. New medicines are derived from compounds in wild species. And plant breeders use genes in wild species to protect and improve crops. There's so many benefits to biodiversity, yet biodiversity is being destroyed. We need to set priorities. People often oppose environmental protections because they fear adverse economic consequences. Planning helps people both preserve and profit from biological wealth. Conservation biologists help determine which regions should be targeted for protection first by identifying hotspots. Those are areas with great biodiversity. Ecoregions, focusing on these hotspots and critical ecoregions characterized by climate, geography, and the species within them, rather than individual species, helps to sustain biological diversity. Conservation biologists at the World Wildlife Fund have defined 867 distinctive land ecoregions considered to be the top priority for conservation efforts. Many ecological important regions are protected in ways that would also benefit local people, such as tourism. For an example, the Monteverde cloud forest in Costa Rica. Ecological restoration is required when a natural ecosystem has been degraded or destroyed, such as the Louisiana coastal wetlands. Ecological restoration is actively altering an area in an effort to restore or create a functional ecosystem, usually modeled back after what it would have been like before humans invaded. Conserving biodiversity, our key concept for this part of the chapter, states that Earth's biodiversity is the product of billions of years of evolution, and our well-being definitely depends on sustaining it. Conservation biologists help us prioritize which areas should be protected first by assessing which are most threatened and which are most biodiverse. Reducing negative impacts. Ultimately, the health of our planet depends on our own ability to recognize the principles of energy flow and resource limitation. We do not have a finite set of resources. We need to protect our resources. Our goal is to live sustainably, which means meeting the needs of the present generation without reducing the ability of future generations to meet their needs. People in industrial nations use enormous quantities of resources, and the extraction, delivery, and use of those resources has negative effects on biodiversity. For example, in the U.S., an average new home contains about 500 pounds of copper wiring and plumbing. Copper mining, though, has a negative impact on the earth. It strips vegetation and soil. It creates an ecological dead zone and produces mountains of waste and causes air and water pollution. To promote sustainability, we need to reduce, reuse, and recycle. We need to fix or recycle electronics to reduce extraction of these non-renewable minerals and keep them out of landfills. We need to reduce fossil fuel use to reduce global warming and acid rain and impacts of extraction and transportation. We need to use less energy with energy efficient appliances like fluorescent bulbs and adjusting our thermostats. And we need to produce locally produced goods. Each of us may have little impact, but our collective behavior of all 7 billion of us on the planet, good or bad, will determine the future of the planet. We need to support efforts to preserve and restore local biodiversity. For example, volunteers restored the Little Salmon River in Idaho so that salmon could once again migrate upstream to their breeding grounds. Reducing negative impacts, extraction of fuel and other resources harms the environment. Individual actions that minimize the use of resources and energy can help reduce the threats to the health of the planet and to biodiversity. And we revisit our story from the beginning of the chapter. 8 countries, including the US, Canada, and Russia, control parts of the Arctic and have rights to extensive oil, gas, and mineral deposits. Ice sheets covering the Arctic Ocean and Arctic land masses are melting, making it easier to remove the minerals and fossil fuels from the Arctic. But, as we learned at the beginning of our chapter, the ice sheets melting, it makes it harder for organisms like the polar bears to be able to walk on the ice to get to their food source. Extracting these resources will further harm Arctic species, like the polar bear, that are already threatened by global climate change.